Kim Jong-un's China visit strengthens his hand in nuclear talks. Beijing, with a dose of mystery and the flair of a showman, North Korea's young leader, Kim Jong-un, used his debut as an international statesman on Wednesday to present himself as confident, reasonable, and willing to bargain. Mr. Kim's surprise two-day visit to Beijing, his first known overseas trip since taking power, was effectively a reminder of how much he has set the agenda in the crisis over his nation's nuclear arsenal, and of what a strong hand he is going into talks, first with President Moon Jae-in of South Korea next month and later with President Trump. Mr. Kim has yet to say what concessions he is willing to make, or what he may demand from the United States in return. But he continued to dominate the diplomatic process, reaffirming his willingness to meet with Mr. Trump and repeating his vague commitment to the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula in talks with Mr. Xi, according to Xinhua, the Chinese state news agency. During Mr. Trump's first year in office, Mr. Kim raced ahead with breakthrough tests of a hydrogen bomb and missiles capable of hitting the United States mainland. Then he abruptly changed course and used the Winter Olympics to seize the initiative, surprising the world with a rapprochement with the South and then an offer to meet with Mr. Trump. Through it all, the Trump administration has been largely relegated to reacting and catching up to Mr. Kim. And so it was again this week, when Mr. Kim suddenly showed up in China on an armored train and was shown beaming next to Mr. Xi, whose cooperation has been critical to Mr. Trump's strategy of maximum pressure on the North. The state media in China and North Korea announced the meeting on Wednesday, after 2 days of secrecy. When Xi met Kim, how China and North Korea depicted it. March 28, 2018 Kim Jong-un met with Xi Jinping in secret. Beijing visit. March 27, 2018 graphic. North Korea is firing up the reactor that could upset Trump's talks with Kim. March 27, 2018 4 countries are responsible for the colonialism and wars that have left the Korean Peninsula divided and the Korean people in a state of can't just imagine what's going through the president's mind right now. I didn't know nuclear talks could be so complicated. Doctors saw her 1 hour ago overseas trip. On a train. An armored train. In images and in words, Mr. Kim and Mr. Xi signaled that they had repaired the relationship between their countries, which had soured as Mr. Kim had accelerated his nuclear program and Mr. Xi had responded by endorsing and enforcing more punishing sanctions proposed by the United States. The friendship between North Korea and China that was personally created and nurtured together by former generations of leaders from both our sides is unshakable, Mr. Kim told Mr. Xi, according to Xinhua. Mr. Xi went out of his way to recall the warm friendship between his father, a high-ranking Communist Party official from the Mao era, and Mr. Kim's father, Kim Jong-il, the North's previous leader. It is too soon to say whether the meeting marks the softening of China's posture toward Mr. Kim or of its commitment to international sanctions against North Korea. But the visit served to highlight Beijing's unique leverage over North Korea, even as Mr. Trump is threatening China with a trade war. Mr. Trump can't talk about maintaining maximum pressure on the North, but ultimately China, the North's main trade partner, still decides what that means, because it can't choose how strictly to enforce sanctions. China is saying to the United States and the rest of the world, anyone who wants a deal on anything on the future of the Korean Peninsula, and certainly something which deals with nukes, don't think you can walk around us, guys. Karen Rudd, the former Australian Prime Minister who is on good terms with the Chinese leadership, said in Hong Kong on Wednesday. The Chinese government said it had briefed the White House on Mr. Kim's visit, adding that Mr. Xi had sent a personal message to Mr. Trump. On Wednesday morning, Mr. Trump expressed optimism on Twitter about the potential for diplomatic success, saying there was a good chance that Mr. Kim would do what is right for his people and for humanity. But there was little in the public accounts of Mr. Xi's discussions with Mr. Kim to support such a positive assessment. Those in who quoted Mr. Kim as saying he was open to talks with Mr. Trump and committed to denuclearization, North Korea's own state media made no mention of either. Xinhua also quoted Mr. Kim as proposing phased, synchronized measures by South Korea and the United States, a phrase that suggests a desire to negotiate a gradual drawdown of his arsenal, but which also echoes the North's position in past talks that dragged on and ultimately failed. One major difference between then and now is that North Korea has a far more advanced nuclear arsenal. Mr. Trump's incoming National Security Advisor, John R. Bolton, meanwhile, has expressed little patience for extended negotiations. He has said that North Korea should be asked to park its nuclear arsenal at the Oak Ridge nuclear facility in Tennessee. If China decides to soften its stance on sanctions and act as North Korea's protector, Mr. Kim will enter the talks with Mr. Trump in a considerably stronger position than he otherwise would have. It is very unlikely that Kim Jong-un consulted with the Chinese before offering to meet Trump, said Sergei Radchenko, a professor of international relations at Cardiff University in Wales. This in itself was a rebellious affront to the Chinese leadership. But by doing this, Kim immeasurably strengthened his negotiating position vis-a-vis the Chinese. He came to Beijing not as a supplicant but as an equal. Many analysts said they believed China had initiated the visit, essentially telling Mr. Kim that he could no longer afford to be cavalier about his bigger, richer neighbor, and telegraphing to Mr. Trump that America could pay heavily for keeping China on the outside. Beneath the new bonhomie in the official accounts of Mr. Kim's trip, the edgy nature of the 7-decade-old China-North Korea relationship was still apparent. No agreements between the two leaders were announced, even on basic issues. Mr. Xi, in his public comments, made no reference to Mr. Kim's expected meeting with Mr. Trump, an omission that may have reflected Mr. Xi's displeasure at being left on the sidelines. There was also no public comment in Beijing about what Mr. Kim was planning to offer Mr. Trump or what role China would play as the talks approached, questions that are of the utmost importance to China. While China supports the international effort to rid North Korea of its nuclear weapons, it has also been careful not to press the North hard enough to risk a collapse of the Kim regime, which could potentially lead to a united Korean peninsula, under an American security umbrella, on China's border. China needs to know North Korea's calculations, said Ye Wei, a professor at the University of International Relations in Beijing. Kim knows the negotiations cannot fully succeed without China's support. China's involvement will make any solution more viable. Some analysts said Mr. Kim was repeating the pattern set by his father, who visited China shortly before his 2000 summit meeting with South Korea's then-president, Kim Il-sung. Kim Jong-il was then about 6 years into his tenure as North Korea's leader, just as his son is now. Now 6 years into his own reign, Kim Il seeks to play a role of the proactive, peace-seeking statesman, said Lee Sung-yoon of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. He may hope to get Mr. Trump to settle for another faulty, open-ended, non-binding nuclear deal that would make it politically near impossible for the U.S. to talk about, let alone implement, a preemptive strike. John Bolton at the head of the National Security Council notwithstanding, Mr. Lee said,